From FlourishDx, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason Van Schie, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in the supporting area. However, today is the second of our expert series, and what we'll be doing today is exploring what is working well in peer support programs and how we can improve them. And we'll be joined today by my colleague, Dr. Alicia Pappas. How are you today, Alicia?
Jason, looking forward to this podcast and recording this with you. I'm not doing too bad. I think you know all about my trials and tribulations, so listeners won't know. I'll fill you in. I've taken over Joelle a little bit now with housing issues. So I've moved house recently and I've purchased a bit of a lemon. So I found out that there's some structural issues at my place, causing some noises, making it hard to sleep when it's raining and windy. So yes.
Fortunately, it doesn't rain that much in Melbourne, right?
Well, I think Perth's got the brunt of the bad weather at the moment, so not too bad today here.
Yeah, but it's kind of like saying it only hurts when I breathe. Like,
true, I know. I'm sure in 2 days.
I only have a problem when it's raining or when it's really sunny. Yeah.
So yeah, in a couple of days, I'm sure I'll be whinging again. After 2 days of good weather, there'll be 2 days of bad weather.
Yeah, so it's really interesting how Joelle's just handed the baton over to you, and she seems to be, getting off scot-free this year, whereas this year it's all on you.
The tables have turned. Yeah, she literally has passed the baton over with the bad luck in the housing front. But yeah, we'll just have to go through the processes, and hopefully the builder takes some accountability.
Well, beware the wrath of Alicia. I hate to be that builder once you're finished with him.
Me too.
Nice one. Hey, I'm really looking forward to the chat today. So as regular listeners of the podcast know, our work is aligned to the integrated model of workplace mental health. This basically, for those who aren't aware, is a holistic approach to employee wellbeing that seeks to meet employees where they're at on the mental health continuum, whether that's on the disorder side, languishing, wellness, or flourishing side. Basically, there's 3 intervention levels in the integrated model, and that is prevent harm, promote flourishing, and mitigate or respond to illness. We largely on the podcast focus on the prevent harm piece, but today we're going to go a little bit to the left-hand side of the continuum and talk a bit more about the respond. And in particular, it's because we've been having a number of conversations with people about what they're doing in relation to peer support. And these programs, although they are intended to improve mental health outcomes within an organisation and be a place where employees can get directed to care quickly, often there are side effects. And if we think about the health and safety context, when you put a control in place, you've got to be aware that sometimes putting a control in place can actually create a risk elsewhere. And we see when peer support programs are put in incorrectly, they can actually do as much harm potentially as what they do good. So for those listeners, though, Alicia, that we have that aren't aware of what a peer support program is, maybe you could start with just kind of articulating to them, what is a peer support program and how do they normally operate?
Yeah, sure. So essentially, they're programs where wellbeing support is offered by peers, by fellow employees. So they're not actually professionals. They don't have the knowledge and the skills necessarily upfront to be able to support employees with mental health concerns or other concerns. So generally what happens is organizations have peer support programs, or mental health first aid is kind of more broadly recognized as a specific program with, dedicated training. And training is psychoeducation based, so understanding what signs and symptoms are of different mental health conditions, and then actually building skills around how to intervene and have conversations and how to support those staff, refer them on. But other more informal peer support programs might offer some type of training to people that express interest in becoming peer supporters, and that training will vary based on the organisation and who's providing the training, whether they outsource it to a third party or they do it in-house. But it's essentially support that's offered, internally by peers, other employees, and managed, I suppose, differently depending on the organisation.
Yeah. So you briefly mentioned there mental health first aid. That is something that our UK and Australian listeners would probably know a lot about. It's very common here and in the UK. I believe in the world there's something like 4 million people that have been trained through the official mental health first aid program. Can you explain a little bit about that program and how it is kind of adjacent to peer support?
Yeah, so mental health first aid, if you think about just first aid in general, so, you've got your first, everyone knows what first aid is, just normal first aid. So, providing, checking if airways are blocked and providing CPR if required. This is the mental health perspective of that. So it's framework based, it's evidence based, and all employees are trained with a specific framework. So it's one, understanding different mental health conditions, so depression, anxiety, substance abuse, etc. And then, what are typical symptom profiles according to those conditions, and then using a particular, intervention strategy to be able to support your fellow employees who may be showing these signs and symptoms. So they use a framework called ALGI is the acronym. So ask, listen, etc., etc., etc. And it's really around gaining the skills, not just understanding signs and symptoms, but gaining the skills to actually respond. So it's very evidence-based, the program, whereas other peer support programs might not be as, I suppose, thorough. The typical training for mental health first aid is like 2 full days of training. So there are different, I suppose, versions of it. There's a full day training or half day training, but typically it's 2 full days of training.
Yeah. So I guess if you think about training of peer supporters, what we're talking about here is dedicated resources in a company where colleagues can be referred to or go and approach if they want to discuss something often related to mental health. And there's different levels of training provided to those peer supporters, right? So some companies do a sheep dipping approach where they provide everyone with a kind of little level of training about how to have, say, a "Are you okay?" conversation, which is a big initiative over here on, how to listen and escalate to care when required. But then you have more significant training, which might be half a day, but then mental health first aid is probably the most intensive training that I'm aware of, at least, Alicia, for peer supporters in a workplace context.
Yeah, for sure. So, it can be as intensive as you want it to be when you're developing a peer support program. So you can actually engage with, consultants, external consultants, or providers of mental health training to devise and develop your own training, whatever that might look like. It couldn't be even more, like you say, intensive or in-depth. You might do, an initial half day or full day of training and then have, subsequent training after that. That might be skills-based. So it's all really dependent on the organisation and how they set up their peer support program and what their objectives for the training are.
Yep. Yeah, no, that makes sense. It is interesting. There are some companies who just rush straight into mental health first aid without realizing that actually maybe that's more than what we actually need in our context.
Yeah.
So it is probably a good point for our listeners to be aware of. There's lots of actual peer support programs that you can develop, and some of them can be more bespoke and not actually just be going through the full mental health first aid program.
Yeah, mental health first aid is very clinical focused, so it does really educate on the more highly prevalent mental health conditions. So you're really taking that, clinical perspective on rather than just offering support. It's trying to help mental health first aiders become a bit more skilled in conditions and then responding to people that might be showing signs and symptoms of these conditions. But the response is all the same. It's just how you can recognise different conditions.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the things that we talked about, and we did a webinar on ourselves, Alicia, with Joelle a few months back now, was around mental health maturity within workplaces. And generally we see probably the first initiative companies will jump into when they're looking to do something around employee mental health is like the EAP. Let's get an employee assistance program so that people have someone to call or go to if they're distressed. Apart from, say, lunch and learns, this is probably, right down there again in terms of the earlier kinds of programs that a company will embrace when they're looking to improve mental health outcomes. Would that be right?
So, the larger organisations, it's very rare to find, well, in Australia anyway, it's very rare to have an organisation that's large, not have an EAP. So in terms of, I suppose that, response pillar, the mitigate illness as part of the integrated approach, organisations will typically have covering that pillar an EAP, as a means to respond to illness, and not necessarily have peer support or mental health first aid as well. EAP is usually the standard.
Yeah, but then if they've already got an EAP and they're looking to do something else, then peer support programs are probably one of those, again, earlier things that they'll jump into. Yeah. And for those that are trying to understand how these sort of programs run, can you take us through, I guess, from beginning to end, I guess, what a peer support program would look like from the point of recruiting a peer supporter to the program actually functioning?
Yeah, so in terms of recruiting, usually an organisation might just put out an expression of interest to staff. It'll be advertising, whether there is appetite or interest for employees to, put their hand up and be a peer supporter or a mental health first aider. Usually those staff that respond are staff with their own either lived experience of mental health issues or indirect experience. So they might have someone, a family member or a friend. They're usually already, I'm just going to say, open to or aware of mental health issues. So that in itself, just thinking about risk, that in itself opens a bit of a Pandora's box, because you're having people put their hands up that may already be vulnerable themselves. So once that expression of interest goes out, or it might be just an open program, and if you're interested at any time, there's usually someone overseeing the program from the organisation's perspective. So someone that might sit in a health and wellbeing team, or they might have more of a dedicated, programs coordinator. So then that person would manage the logistics of the program. So they would then, run training for peer supporters as they come into the program as peer supporters, and just oversee. And it's usually manual. So they might have a list of peer supporters manually that they're managing, say in an Excel sheet or something like that. And they would have to liaise with peer supporters or mental health first aiders routinely, just to see or check in on, availability, if they're going on leave or not, just to keep updating this. They might have some type of a manual list. So it can be quite onerous on that person to manage the logistics of a peer support program or a mental health first aid program. And because usually that's part of somebody's overall role, they don't spend a lot of time doing that. So it's really just around managing those high level logistics. And
I got to say on that one, Alicia, I was having a conversation with a employee benefits manager the other day. 20,000 people in a multinational corporation, and he didn't even know where the list of peer supporters was in their organisation.
And this is it's an organisational challenge. How does a peer support program, especially of when you've got a very large workforce, how does it get effectively managed from that perspective? And that'll impact how staff can access the peer support program or peer supporters, whether the program is even advertised or marketed? Like, what does that look like? When people come into an organization, do they know about the program, et cetera, et cetera. So they're kind of organizational challenges and barriers. I know of a emergency services organization. I guess this is the most comprehensive that I've heard. They actually have they're a peer support program coordinator. That's all they do. But, that's the minority. Most organizations will have somebody who's got multiple functions and responsibilities overseeing peer support. And then there might be, like I said earlier, training and organising the training, and what that training looks like vary, unless it's mental health first aid training, because that's a specific program. And then there might be formal or informal debriefing. So if a peer supporter has a difficult conversation, for example, or it might just be cumulative over time, that they might have, multiple types of these interactions or conversations in a specified time period, they might be struggling themselves. So they can access some type of debriefing that organisations may provide, either through EAP. So that would be up to the individual employee to contact EAP to organise, a conversation, some support. And then other organisations might have more structured debriefing. So they might offer monthly or 6 weekly or quarterly, whatever it is, debriefing that staff peer supporters can opt into. So that might be offered by an internal person, say this, for example, a peer support coordinator, and that person might have, and it's preferable if that person has the right knowledge and skills, if they've got kind of a mental health background, or it can be a bit more informal, so it's just someone else within the organisation offering it, or a third party comes in to offer that. So it'll just depend on, how it's set up and what the organisation is doing to support the process.
Yeah, and the debrief, the monthly or quarterly debrief, as you said, that's probably the one protective factor that I've seen companies put in. Admittedly, it's reactive, right?
Yeah.
So a negative conversation or a negative effect could have occurred based on the trauma associated, or vicarious trauma, as we'll talk to momentarily, from listening to some pretty serious stuff sometimes from the peer supporter that they're not professionally trained to deal with.
Yeah.
So it's happening after the fact, but at least there's some sort of protection in place, and maybe a phone number or the EAP that the peer supporter themselves can speak to if they're distressed after listening to one of their colleagues.
Yeah. I mean, if that's not happening, that's you're just placing a bigger risk having a peer support program. So it's definitely, like you said, reactive. So it's after the event. It's if someone has had a negative experience or a negative wellbeing outcome themselves. And I guess the major gap is, how do you shift that and become more proactive and preventative rather than reactive? That organisational support. Yeah.
Okay, so hopefully that gives our listeners a bit more of an overview if they weren't already familiar with peer support programs. So what I'd like to do now is to talk a little bit more about, I guess, where are the failings or opportunities for improvement, I guess, in peer support programs at the moment. And there's two that we're not going to discuss so much in detail today that you've kind of alluded to already, Alicia, and that is recruiting. So who are you actually getting to become a peer supporter? And then also that debriefing, how that might be able to be done better potentially. But there was three in particular that we wanted to discuss, Alicia. So what was the first one that we wanted to discuss?
Yeah, so I guess it's the challenges, right, with peer support programs. The main one is, we've touched on it earlier, it's employees actually not knowing who peer supporters are. You hope that they know there's a peer support program. So that's the overarching issue. So you need to actually ensure that the peer support program is advertised or marketed so that everyone knows that it's there. But then it's on top of that, it's, making sure peer supporters are available and accessible, and how do you demonstrate that to your workforce? So that's a major, I suppose, barrier to accessing support. So,
yeah, and you can understand why employees might be in the dark, right? Because if the people managing these programs don't even know who they've got on the list of peer supporters, then how are employees supposed to know?
Exactly. And, it can be someone's managing the list or the program from a logistics perspective. That person might go on leave for a couple of weeks, a month. They might change roles. They might change jobs and leave the organization. And if there's no appropriate handover for these periods, then sometimes even the peer support program goes amiss. And it's not until an issue occurs that it's brought to the table again. So it's quite onerous, managing the logistics of such a program, especially when there's not a dedicated role to do that within an organization.
Yeah, and I think over the pandemic in particular, people who weren't juggling probably were juggling more and being asked to do more and more as part of their role. So I think we all understand, right, that things can slide a bit when you've got multiple focuses in one role.
Yeah.
So the way I've generally seen peer supporters within a program made available or visible to their peers would be through, maybe notice boards. Back in the time when we were in the office regularly, and maybe on the on the pinboard, and maybe on the intranet or something like that, you'd have a list of, hey, here's our mental health first aiders or here's our peer supporters. That's the main way, right? Like, have you seen any other ways that companies highlight who their peer supporters are or the program itself?
In this day and age, it is usually the intranet. That's kind of your main communication medium. So there'll be, a section on the intranet that you'd have to know to go to that section, whether it's a health and wellbeing section or whatnot. And there'd be kind of a link that you click with information about the program. And then there might be, the names of peer supporters with photos so that you could identify the person. And that would probably be actually the most comprehensive way. If you've got frontline workers, so just thinking about, say, police and emergency services, where they've got quite, non-desk-based roles and they're out in the front line, they usually have their programs also kind of advertised, like we said, on these notice boards or in high-traffic areas.
Yeah, so it's a key gap in these programs, right, that, if companies are going to be investing heavily, and let's face it, things like mental health first aid training, the cost of the training and then the time out of the office for people to do that training is expensive. It's not uncommon for companies to have even 5 to 10% of their workforce, if not more, trained in these programs. So they're expensive programs, but then if you're not making those peer supporters visible to their colleagues, it's kind of like, well, who are you supporting?
Yeah. I mean, they're good in theory. It's the practicability of actually, having these programs in place. That's oftentimes where it can fall down, or they're not utilised as they could be. So, and speaking of utilisation, another challenge is, you've got these programs which are they're there as wellbeing programs, and they're very, I guess it's voluntary based, right? You put your hand up to become a peer supporter or a mental health first aider. So they're not necessarily, I don't know, the uptake isn't visible, right? Because it's voluntary and it's in confidence. So there's a big gap there in, a lot of organisations don't know how many peer supporters are getting accessed and what's the uptake, and there's no actual data. So, when you compare it to something like EAP, where it's a third party, after every EAP session or counselling service, the EAP provider, completes a bit of some session notes or some high-level data, and it feeds back into reporting that goes back to the organisation. So all the identified information, but there's high-level reporting there. So it'll give at least you've got some utilisation data, but with mental health first aid and peer support programs, that doesn't generally exist.
Yeah, so it's a problem, right? I mean, a lot of people, I think, go into peer support or training mental health first aid because they believe it's the right thing to do. They believe it will make a difference. Um, their heart's in the right place, but then the ongoing kind of management and making sure that the utilization is there is lacking. And I'd imagine that would be a big business risk if you're thinking about, like, if you're the person responsible for these programs and want to see these programs really do well in creating the business case. If you can't give the organization metrics about utilization rates and the benefits being obtained from these programs, next time, you're going to be asking for training for peer supporters or, asking to do something around your peer support program, I reckon it'd be pretty hard to find budget to do extra initiatives.
Yeah, exactly. So, it would be in the organization's best interest to be able to have some data around utilization and also effectiveness of the program, and even to the point where you can have some data around your peer supporters and how the support they're providing is impacting them.
Yeah, and for listeners who think we're just making this stuff up, I mean, this comes from conversations with clients. I mean, I was speaking to one a couple of months ago, and they've got something like 15% of their company trained in mental health first aid, and it's been years since they last reviewed how many conversations were likely to be happening, what sort of topics were coming up in those, whether people even still felt competent in their ability to have a conversation with a peer on a mental health related topic. So that's actually a large period of time where harm could be occurring to the poor peer supporters who are being charged with being in the front line in relation to the mental health efforts of the organisation.
Yeah, so I guess that's another major risk or challenge with having these peer support programs is, is there and what is the harm being done to the actual help givers, the peer supporters and mental health first aiders. So, I think it's now known that there's a mental health risk or a vicarious trauma risk for peer supporters. But, how does that get managed and in a proactive way?
Yeah, so just briefly, we have actually done a whole episode on vicarious trauma. That was with Jackie Wilmshurst, I believe, and we're talking about content moderators specifically. But for those listeners who are unfamiliar with the term vicarious trauma, can you just give them a brief rundown of what that is?
Yeah, so it's basically if you're exposed to trauma indirectly, or from an indirect source, so you might be hearing about from your fellow employees, from your peers, you might be hearing about topics or information that's quite sensitive, and it could be impacting you because you might have a personal experience of that, or you've heard about these types of topics or traumas before, and it's cumulative over time. And then unbeknownst to you, oftentimes, it can be this cumulative trauma, or something could have such a big impact on you that then you start to experience symptoms of the trauma. So it's not you directly experiencing it; it's through hearing about it through secondary sources.
Yeah, so I can imagine most of our listeners would understand what trauma is. Being exposed to, say, if you're a first responder, being exposed to a fatality or someone who is, saying that they're going to kill themselves or something like that, occupational violence, that's all examples of trauma. But vicarious trauma, as you say, is that indirect exposure where you're either watching it or listening to it or hearing about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the case of peer support mental health first aid, it's going to be you hear it because you're providing support to others, and it's through what they're telling you. It can be traumatic for you as well to hear it.
Yeah. So besides the debriefing sessions that, let's face it, not all companies do. Some companies do for peer supporters. Are you aware of any other ways that companies are managing that vicarious trauma risk for peer supporters?
Honestly, that's the main, organizational support that's offered, and then debriefing itself has its own issues because there's research out there that says debriefing is not necessarily a positive for everyone. It can actually re-trigger going through it again and rehashing it again. So it's important, it's good to offer it, because actually talking through an experience can help, with working through it and healing and whatnot. But for other people, it may not do that. So it's important to offer it as an opt-in, not a compulsory. But, it's in addition to group debriefing like that. The other option is, access EAP, so you can talk to someone one-on-one about how you're feeling. Or it might be encouraging the peer supporters to seek help or support through other avenues internally. So talk to your manager, for example, or just talking to another co-worker, so that, we know their protective factors, manager support and co-worker support. So they're the main, I suppose, avenues.
Yeah, no, that's definitely my experience as well.
Cool. So, so we've just talked about peer support programs, and that you actually need organizational supports and structures to protect the mental health of your help givers, so your peer supporters and mental health first aiders. So oftentimes, these organizational supports are in the form of debriefing, or they're quite reactive. Do you have any insights into why kind of protection of help givers is lacking or missing from these programs, from a more of a prevention perspective?
Yeah, I've thought about this a bit, Alicia, and really, I think the only thing that really explains it is that there's this lack of education or awareness or options or tools out there to help companies do this effectively. Let's face it, you don't put a peer support program in unless you actually fundamentally believe that mental health is important, and as a company you have some sort of responsibility to do something to assist the mental health of your employees. What we often see, though, is things like mental health first aid, or even quite extensive peer support programs. They're kind of put in because they're popular. If you look up mental health training, for example, online, generally mental health first aid would be taking up the first few pages of Google. So it's a very common approach. It's around peer support. And companies just don't know any better. Let's face it, not all of them can have a Dr. Alicia Pappas working internally, right? So, they're trying to do the best they can with the knowledge that they have. And there's some very good marketers out there as well who are saying, hey, this will solve a lot of your problems, without actually talking about, well, what are the risks of these sorts of programs, and what sort of controls can you think about from a systemic or an organizational perspective to kind of manage the downside risks when you're bringing in what should be a positive benefit, right, for the well-being of employees. So I'd love to say it's something specifically, but I think it's largely just lack of education and awareness on behalf of the people who are charged with developing and running these programs internally.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Having a peer support program, a mental health first aid training program, offering that to your staff, it's good on face value. It's good to have these programs, but if you just run these programs as they're advertised, like you say, so sign your people up to do the training, but then you don't have those management systems and support structures around the people giving the support, then you're just introducing risks, and there's more gaps, right? So it's one thing to have the programs and to provide the training, but then it's another thing to actually manage the program effectively and prevent risk to your people providing the support.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things we wanted to talk about, Alicia, is, there's obviously all these problems that we've identified, and it's not that the peer support programs inherently are bad. It's just that we feel that there are obviously some unintended consequences of these programs where they're bringing in risks that companies may not be aware of, and largely the tools have been lacking to actually mitigate those risks effectively. So listeners, don't think we're just going to bring you a bunch of problems and no solutions. We've been thinking about this for a number of months now, and we believe that we've got some solutions to some of these problems that we've outlined. Yeah.
So maybe Jason, just for our listeners' benefit, just going through some of the solutions that we've come up with, and that will be available in the near future.
Yeah, it's a benefit of having a technology company, right? And being, subject matter experts like ourselves. Like it's like we get to be kids in a candy store to some degree, right? If we can dream it, our team can build it, which is really amazing. So it's been great talking to people over the last number of months about their peer support programs. What are the common issues and how we might be able to use a technology platform like we have access to be able to address some of these things. So if we think about one of the first issues that Alicia raised, which is around how do people identify who a peer supporter is and how do they connect with a peer supporter. One of the things that we are building at the moment into FlourishDx, which will be available in November, is a peer support. It's a whole new peer support feature. There's a number of elements to it, but the first part is actually having a directory of peer supporters. We have a number of parts of our solution that direct people to support when they need it. So, for example, if they're using the wellbeing check-in and they respond negatively, then they're told, hey, these are the organisational supports that are available. And that will usually point to things like the EAP or crisis support numbers. So we'll have in there, another one. Here's the peer supporters that are available. And if they go there, they can look for certain topics, locations, mode of communication, like, I'm available, I want to talk to someone over telephone, or I want to speak face-to-face in this particular office. And then they'll be presented with a list of peer supporters who can talk to that topic and be available in the mode of communication when they need that help. So that's one way we're trying to address that particular issue. The second issue that you raised was around utilisation. Often peer support programs, you kind of like build them up, you train up your supporters, and then you release them out to the wild, and then it's very hard to get data around utilisation. And the example you gave before, Alicia, around EAP programs is actually a great example of the sort of data we should be trying to get from our peer support programs. So how many people are accessing this, week to week or month to month? What are the main topics that are coming up? I mean, if you think about it, if you could collect that data from a peer support program, you could actually not just be identifying personal issues, which is all well and good, but you could actually be identifying what are the workplace factors or psychosocial hazards that may be contributing to people, getting to that point where they feel they need to reach out to a peer supporter to discuss. And if we could compare month to month, then we could see, hey, are we making improvements in utilisation, or are we addressing some of these hazards that are being identified? There would be a really rich source of information, particularly if the programs are well utilised, right? So we figured, why not create a new category of user in our platform, which will be the peer support user. And then these people will have an additional function available within the app. And that will be to create, like your EAP providers, some brief information about the conversation that was had. So it'd be things like, who initiated the conversation. And it might be the employee themselves. It might be the peer supporter. It might be a line manager who recommended that the individual go and reach out to the peer supporter. We could talk about, where it happened. So I guess you could hotspot across your organisation. Where is the peer support program most being utilised? Where is it not? So you can kind of target your attention about, hey, do we need to do some more communications in this particular area of the business in order to improve peer support program utilisation? And then we, like I mentioned, could actually collect information around what are the main personal or work-related factors that are contributing to people wanting to reach out to the peer supporter. And then that would be a very rich source of information for psychosocial hazards, which could inform your risk assessment when you go to do that. So one of the other things we're doing as part of that is we're getting our peer supporters to reflect on how they felt as a result of having that conversation with their colleague. And if they are responding, hey, this actually had a negative impact on me, then we're suggesting, hey, here's the escalation pathways for you. So really getting individuals, rather like you said, Alicia, when you're exposed to vicarious trauma, often you don't know that it's having a negative impact on your mental health because it builds up over time. So really getting the peer supporter to pause for a moment and actually think, hey, did this actually have a positive, neutral or negative impact on how I feel? And then getting that escalation pathway. And at the same time, we're actually asking people, did they feel competent in having that conversation? And, whether training is required on a particular topic. And that way we can continually improve our peer support programs, right, by identifying, hey, there seems to be a gap here, or people aren't feeling as competent. Maybe we need to do a full refresher training, or maybe we need to provide content to our peer supporters on particular areas that keep coming up. Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. So there's some great features as part of that overall peer support function within FlourishDx.
But I haven't even talked about the most important one, Alicia.
Yeah, I was going to say there's one main one that we've talked about is, protecting peer supporters' own mental health, especially from vicarious trauma. So maybe tell our listeners a bit about how that component will work.
Yeah, well, it occurred to me, through discussions with yourself and Joelle and other people in our network, that there really isn't any systemic controls to prevent vicarious trauma from occurring for peer supporters, right? There's the debriefing, which we talked about is after the fact, but how do we actually prevent, say, a peer supporter from having a conversation that's likely to be triggering, or being asked to have a peer support conversation with a colleague when maybe they're not in the right mental state themselves to have that conversation. And so I thought, well, if we've got this directory that we're managing within FlourishDx of peer supporters, and we get to ask people when they're looking for a peer supporter, hey, what topic would you like to discuss? And it's a broad topic, right? It might be things like family, it might be children, it might be relationships. Well, let's then give peer supporters, by managing their own profile, the ability to opt out of certain conversations that they might find triggering. So you might find, for instance, that someone who has a lived experience of domestic violence, they don't want to talk about partner issues. Someone who has lived experience of child abuse or something like that, they might want to not talk about anything to do with children because they would find those conversations triggering. Well, they would be able to opt out of those sort of conversations, because if on their profile, they'd be able to say, look, that's not something that I want to discuss. And then when their colleagues are looking for someone to talk to, then we would screen out those peer supporters who weren't comfortable talking to that particular topic. The other thing, which is a more simple feature, is, hey, I'm not in the right headspace as a peer supporter to have a conversation. I'm dealing with my own life and my own issues. I want to turn off my availability for the next week, for instance. So they can kind of set or maybe, I'm off site, or, I'm traveling or whatever. They can make it so that they're not available for their colleagues to reach out to. So with those two things, it is actually then a systemic control to prevent potentially triggering conversations happening, or conversations happening when a peer supporter is not mentally ready themselves to have those conversations, and hopefully would actually prevent a lot of, the vicarious trauma that a peer supporter could be exposed to, reducing that risk of harm to them, right?
Yeah, exactly. And even touching on what we were talking about before around the logistics and having somebody managing a list or a database of peer supporters, it actually eliminates the need for peer supporters or mental health first aiders to contact a person in the organization, to go into the list and to make them unavailable manually for a period of time, then have to remember to make them available again. So it's actually reducing admin burden as well on the staff member or members that are managing the peer support program.
Yeah, and another thing that won't make it into version 1, unfortunately, but will be coming hopefully soon afterwards, will be being able to see which of your peer supporters are being utilised the most, right? Mm-hmm. And then that could prompt, say, a peer support manager, which would be another user type within Flourish, the person charged with managing the program and getting, the aggregate statistics coming up on a daily basis. And that's, again, the beauty of a technology platform. We can see the utilisation data in real time, rather than waiting for, say, the monthly EAP report to see what the utilisation has been. But they would then hopefully be able to see those, hey, this peer supporter has had 10 hours of peer support conversations in the last month.